Hi, my name is Nicole Bijlsma. I'm a building biologist. I established the building biology industry in early 2000 as a result of two events that happened in my life. Firstly, starting to notice a very strong correlation between many of my patients' illnesses with asthma, allergies and chronic fatigue-like issues and their homes. Many of the patients by the third consultation were talking about the visible mould or the meter panel near their head, etc. But it wasn't until I moved into our own home, our first home in Warrandyte, that I really felt the full brunt of living in a sick home. It was a beautiful home, half an acre on the river. It was what my family would describe as a B&B, and it was lovely. However, something wasn't right, because within days of moving in, my husband and I weren't sleeping very well, and I was a fantastic sleeper. And then over a period of 7 years, I had 10 miscarriages. So I started to look at the fact that everything went pear-shaped in the house and realised we were sleeping on the other side of the wall of a meter panel. And of course that's high electro AC magnetic fields. It was an old meter panel as opposed to this new smart meters, because this was some time ago. And also because we were living on a T intersection, the vehicle exhaust would come up through the garage, which was closest to the T intersection, and then come up through the floorboards into our master bedroom and triple. So our carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide levels would triple in the morning and take about 2 to 3 hours to dissipate with the minimal ventilation we had through our windows. And then by the time it dissipated to background levels, it would then rise because of the peak hour traffic in the afternoon. On top of that, we had a geomancer come through, and he said there's geopathic stress directly beneath your bed, and that was verified by the fact that we had a wasp nest in direct line very close to that area, which is very common. Nests and termites and pests are very common signs of moisture and geopathic stress, and sometimes electromagnetic field issues. Then we would come home and the Parks Victoria would be spraying our blackberry bushes with pesticides. So the universe was going, Nicole, you're going to learn exactly what happens in a house that looks perfectly healthy and is not, and what the ramifications of that are. And thanks to that house, I established the Australian College of Environmental Studies, which runs the only government accredited course in electromagnetic field testing, mould testing, chemical sampling for homes, geopathic stress, etc. In Australia, and it's a nationally accredited course, and it's been accredited since 2005. So basically we're building biologists, which means we go to people's homes to see if the house is making them sick. And at least 90% of the time there is an elephant in your house. In fact, I'd argue there are elephants in all of our homes. In some homes there are little baby elephants, and others there are freaking herds. And many of you have herds, which is why you're unwell. So the first thing is, there is a reason why you are sick. And unfortunately, medicine and natural therapies train people to treat symptoms, not to get to the cause of their patient's problems, unfortunately. So unless diet is the cause of your problem, and I can tell you right now, diet is important, actually very important, because it provides the resilience to deal with the environmental onslaughts and changes. The problem is that our food is grown in nutrient deficient soils. We have rampant use of organochlorine and organophosphate pesticides, and of course glyphosate, Roundup, which are all pretty much carcinogens. And as a result of farming practices, the nutrients are so deficient that even if you eat good quality food, unless it's organic and biodynamic, which is the best, then your ability to even deal with the changes in the environment has completely been compromised. I wrote a paper in May this year interviewing the top 17 environmental doctors in Australia and New Zealand to see how they deal with environmental chemicals in their patients with fatiguing syndrome, and it's impossible for them to do that because the laboratory tests are not available for many of the chemicals we're exposed to. And of course, once it gets into the body, the microbiome on the skin, the lungs and the gut completely transform into different metabolites. So what do we test once it's in the blood and the urine? It's very difficult. But the one thing they agreed on is that the most effective way to diagnose illnesses and get to the cause is to actually undertake an extensive environmental exposure history. And they all agreed it takes 90 minutes to take a proper environmental exposure history with their patients. However, none of them were trained to do this in their medical degree, and as a result of this, it took them 2, 3, 4 decades to come up with their own tool, which goes to show that we're completely failing patients with chronic related illnesses because we're not even asking the right questions, and instead we're focusing on diagnosing you into a box to justify which drugs or supplements to give you, when in fact we should be ignoring a lot of that and actually going to what's causing or triggered the illness in the first place. So that's what my PhD has been doing, is identifying these suitable questions to ask in order to understand at what point in time your symptoms developed and what triggered those illnesses, because there is always a reason why you are sick. So as a result of that, I started to look at how the environment has completely changed for human health, and it seemed to have gone pear-shaped around after World War II. As a result of the development of the pharmaceutical and the agricultural and the industrial industries, we have significantly escalated the amount of chemicals that we are exposed to on a daily basis. There are currently over 143 million chemicals registered for use on the world's largest database, the Chemical Abstract Service. Just to put that into context, that's around 20 new chemicals every 60 seconds, and there are around 200,000 new chemicals that are released and registered for use on this database every single week. Of the man-made portion of those chemicals, 80 to 90% of them have never been tested for their impact on human health. As a result of this, we have found large population biomonitoring studies have identified numerous chemicals in humans from birth, from the womb to the tomb, at levels known to cause adverse health effects. And many of these, hundreds of these chemicals in every generation. So every generation that comes in has more and more of these toxicants, and we're starting to realise that these exposures can occur from the grandparents, passing it on to their parents and then on to the newborn. Because when a woman is pregnant, by 14 weeks of that pregnancy, if she has a female fetus, that fetus will have all of her eggs for the rest of her life. So whatever the mother is exposed to will be passed on to her daughter and to all of her grandchildren, because her daughter already has the eggs to be able to fertilise her future children. We know many of the environmental toxicants, by that I mean man-made chemicals, that are in the body are actually passed on through other generations. And in fact, the most effective way for a woman to detox is actually to get pregnant, pass it on through the placenta and through the breast milk, because most of these environmental toxicants are lipophilic. We call them persistent organic pollutants. So it is unfortunate, and of course the World Health Organization has indicated that the most effective biomarker for environmental toxicants and assessment in the human body is actually breast milk, because it is primarily fat, and that's where most of these environmental toxicants are going. So you can see from that alone, that's not good news. If we're passing on and have been exposed, especially since the Industrial Revolution and post-World War II, changes in farming practices that launched pesticides that are released that are now found from the Arctic to the Antarctica and even in polar bear liver, despite the fact that pesticide spraying and crop dusting did not occur for at least 15,000 kilometres to the Arctic and Antarctica. So it's everywhere, it's in all of us. Every human that has been tested through the National Health and Nutritional Examination Survey, which is the largest population biomonitoring survey in the US, has found DDT and organochlorines in every single person that comes through, even though that child may have not been exposed, but it's coming through the placenta and through the breast milk. So we are being born pre-polluted. Now that has a problem, because of course how we deal with these chemicals varies enormously. In fact, there's a tenfold variation in how people actually detox chemicals. And what we're starting to get a gist of is that our microbiome on our skin, in our lungs, in our gut is probably more effective at dealing with detoxification of chemicals than even our liver. So what becomes important then is to make sure that you're not exposed to chemicals that are going to kill off your bacteria and reduce your ability to detox. When someone walks past someone who's smoking, the cigarette smoke can land on will land on your skin. Now, Micrococcus, Pseudomonas and Staphylococcus are bacteria naturally found on your skin. They're gram-positive bacteria, and they will start transmuting that cigarette smoke, which contains over 3,000 chemicals, before it even gets into your blood. This is what we now realise, is that there is over 852 bacteria in your body that will detox chemicals as efficiently as your liver. So it's really important, therefore, to think about, when it comes to exposure, any exposure you have to antibacterials, and they include pesticides, which you have in all of your bodies. Of course, pesticides through your food can have devastating impacts in terms of your gut microbiome. Chlorinated water, which we introduced post-industrial revolution, is an issue, of course. And what was so profound as I started to work as a naturopath is I'm going, 5 years into practice, I had a sort of a bit of a meltdown, because I realised I've been trained to treat symptoms, except my vitamins and minerals have less side effects than most drugs. That's a problem, because what I should have been trained to do is to identify and take a proper environmental exposure history to get to the cause of the patient's problems. This is really important. So prior to the farming and the changes in farming practices, we literally introduced antibacterials across the entire planet. We have them in our bodies, and that's a problem, because we now know this gut microbiome is very important in the ability to detox chemicals. Chlorination of water has been fantastic to reduce the waterborne illnesses, but unfortunately that has come at a cost, because the reason we put chlorine in our water is to kill bacteria in the main distribution system. If you ingest chlorinated water, what impact does it have on the gut microbiome you have within the body? That's the question. So 5 years into practice, I'm going, here's a $40 probiotic, and I'm getting the patient to drink it with chlorinated water. That's not a good idea, using the logic. So what's really important, therefore, is that patients have a water filter, even if it's just a cheap carbon block filter, 1 or 5 microns, will be effective in getting rid of their chlorine. If you did nothing else, that is the first part all clinicians should address first: clean air and water. You can't maintain health or have a level of well-being if you continue to drink tap water. There are so many issues in tap water. We spend 120 hours on tap water in the building biology course, which I train people in. And of course, the big ones are chlorine and fluoride. Most countries in the world have never fluoridated their water supply, simply because it's unethical to mass medicate an entire population with a known pharmaceutical drug. It is a pharmaceutical drug because it treats a disease referred to as plaque and tooth decay, for example, and as a result of this, it's a drug. Now, can you imagine giving a drug to a patient, a doctor giving a drug to a patient for which they would never ever monitor, and say you can have as much or as little of that drug as you want your whole life and no one's going to monitor you? That's just nuts. And that's why Europe rejected fluoridated water in the 60s and the 70s. Unfortunately, Australia is one of the very few countries that fluoridate its water supply, and it is a problem because it targets the pineal gland, it targets the thyroid, and there's so much data on this now that we really we need to be pulling it out of our water supply. The only way you're going to do that is a reverse osmosis system, which is expensive. Now, when it comes to water filters, really it's basic. It's the physics of water filtration is simple. Don't get caught up in all this ridiculous volcanic rock and, this is a $6,000 system. You're being ripped off. Anything above $1,200 for an RO system is too expensive. Obviously, you need to plumb it in properly, but the RO system is normally a 5 or 6 stage filter system consisting of polypropylene sediment filters to get rid of the larger particles like sediment in the distribution system, and then of course carbon block filters. Get rid of all your organic chemicals like petrochemicals and your pesticides, which are organic or carbon based. Of course, you want to get rid of the chlorine, which carbon does very effectively, but it's the osmosis or the ultramembrane, which is the most expensive part of the reverse osmosis system, which has a very fine ultramembrane to get rid of small atoms like fluoride, and that's why it's so difficult to get rid of, because fluoride is such a tiny atom, and therefore you need these membranes to get rid of it. So I think one of the most important things you could do with any chronic illness or to enforce good health is a water filter is not a luxury, it's absolutely mandatory. Now, so my husband and I have a whole house water filtration system. The filters are this big. We have a pre-sediment filter and we have a carbon block filter. We drink our water supply. Our distributor is Yarra Valley Water. That is considered to be one of the cleanest water supplies in the world. It comes from Sugarloaf Reservoir, and that is a forested catchment area, which means people aren't allowed in there. And that is considered to be one of the cleanest. Unfortunately, when they say your water is clean, they test it at the reservoir. Very little of it gets tested at your tap. Why that's a problem is because it's just gone through hundreds of kilometres of mains distribution system containing asbestos cement sheet, iron, cast iron, potentially lead. We still have lead pipe used up until 1920s in cities like Melbourne and Sydney, because that's what they used, pure lead pipe. Of course, then when we used galvanised pipe in the 60s and 70s, we used lead solder. So that is an issue also. And there's been interesting research, especially in schools, to show that there's significant lead levels if it sits in the distribution system for periods of time. And we know this. That's why I tell my children, never drink the water out of the taps on a Monday morning when it's sitting in there for 48 hours over the weekend, because any lead solder will be coming through as it sits in the pipes as it warm up. And of course, after a 6 weeks holiday in the Christmas period, it's a disaster, especially if the school is old, built prior to the 70s, where they're going to have lead solder, or even a very old school that was built prior to the 1920s, and if the pipes were not replaced. So that's important. Many of the terrace homes in Melbourne we've tested have significant lead levels in their water supply, and that's something most clinicians have no idea about. So environmental exposure history critical. That's why I've spent so much time in my PhD looking at what questions clinicians need to ask in order to identify what's causing these illnesses. And I'm here to say that most of the illnesses that we now have, the chronic illnesses that we have in society, are there because you've got elephants in your home. So drinking water is a big one. I've mentioned fluoride and chlorine. I've mentioned lead and copper. I haven't mentioned high levels of copper. How do you establish that? Well, when you go away from your house, come back in, put the hot water tap on. If it's a greeny, bluey colour for the first few seconds, it's probably copper. Bathtub, if you have an old enamel bathtub, you can see that greeny blue drip on the enamel indicating you have copper pipe. Now, copper is generally an issue if in the first 3 to 5 years of a new home. Why? Because the copper hasn't oxidised. So when you are laying copper pipe for hot water systems, they should be good grade, and that's expensive because copper has gone through the roof, and it should be oxidised. So it shouldn't be shiny, it should be a dull colour, which means it's oxidising or has oxidised, which means it's less likely to leach copper ions into the water supply. So that's important. Otherwise it could be exposed to higher levels of copper, which can cause gastric symptoms, and it can reflect what we refer to as an acute abdomen. Several years ago, about 15 years ago, I had a patient come into the clinic. She had put on 20 kilos of weight within 3 months. She'd seen many naturopaths and doctors to no avail, and came to me as a last resort. And in the second consultation, as I went through an extensive exposure history, I said, when did your symptoms begin? And she said, oh, they began in February when I moved into my boyfriend's apartment. I said, well, what symptoms did you have? And she said, I had acute abdominal pain that was so severe I was hospitalised with an acute abdomen, and they excluded ectopic pregnancy, bowel obstruction, and thought it was my appendix, so they took it out, even though it wasn't inflamed. Anyway, she still had pain, and she ended up living on Panadol because of this pain for 3 or 4 months to manage her pain. And of course that has other side effects and issues. And I said, well, what happened in February and January? And she said, I don't know. I said, did you change jobs? What was your relationship like? Was there stress in your lives with relationships? Do you take prescriptive medication or recreational drugs? And what was your diet? Nothing changed. And I said, well, did you move house? She said, yes. I moved into my boyfriend's house in January, mid-January. I said, well, okay, tell me about that. What type of house is it? It's an apartment in Hawthorne, ironically. And she said, and as I asked her questions about the house, eventually got to the water supply, and I said, what colour does the water come out when you aren't in the house for a few days? She said, it's a greeny blue colour. Every morning I turn the tap on. I said, oh, okay, that's not good. It's a new apartment, and that's what I was saying, that in new apartments, copper's going to corrode in the first 5 years, and then after that, when it's oxidised, it's less likely. So, interesting is I looked at the symptoms of copper poisoning. Acute abdomen is one of those symptoms, which is probably why she ended up presenting in the hospital with that, but they would not have checked for toxic metals. Now, because she's put on 20 kilos of weight, there's a theory called the obesogen hypothesis, coined by Professor Bruce Armstrong from Bruce Blumberg from the University of California in 2006. He termed the word obesogens, chemicals that make people fat. There is a hypothesis that the reason why infants and children may be getting bigger is because the body is shunting the chemicals into the fat to keep it away from the vital organs. So when she loses weight, what's going to happen? She'll get sicker because she's mobilising those toxic metals. It depends on the metal. Lead, we know, goes into the bones. Other toxic metals get into the fat. We'll mobilise it back into the body. So the worst thing she could do is go on a fast or a strict diet, because she needs really good nutritional supplementation to support the chelation and removement of those metals out of her fat, in order to make sure it gets out through her skin and her urine. And that's where infrared saunas are useful, you know, good diaphoretics, for example, and other, you know, clean water. Because, you know, if she doesn't get off the water or get a water supply, you can see that everything that a great physician or integrated doctor would do is useless, because they didn't get to the cause of the problem. And this is the problem. I spent $60,000 on a double degree in naturopathy and acupuncture, and I was pissed off. I didn't learn these tools. I studied in China and did postgraduate training then, and go, why have I got 10 miscarriages and no one can help me? Why is it that these patients with fatiguing illnesses aren't helped? So you're given a term that doesn't really help you at all in understanding what caused the illness or how to treat the illness. And I'm here to tell you is we now know what's going on. Unfortunately, it takes 17 years to go from medical to scientific literature to medical practice. It's a slow filtration system, and I would argue evidence-based medicine has kept many doctors and clinicians and patients in the dark at the cost of human health and at the positiveness of the industry keeping these products and these telecommunications products into the industry that have never been tested for their impact on human health. We know what causes many of these illnesses. There are very strong associations, correlations in the scientific literature to state that pesticides, without fail, are one of the strongest correlations to most chronic illnesses. So in my first paper, which I published in 2016 in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, was to look at which toxicants are associated with which illnesses. And without fail, pesticides are associated with most of them. Why? Because it kills bacteria, and your gut microbiome is critical to human health. So one of the most important things you can do is to eat organic food. Why? Not because the nutrient content is likely to be different, but because of two things. It doesn't contain pesticides, and pesticides will kill off bacteria, which is what they're designed to do. Secondly, because we've started to realise that the bacteria found on your fruit and your vegetables are very important, potentially very important, to program your gut microbiome, to educate your gut how to digest the food. 2 years ago, a really important study came out in Japan about nori, which is the seaweed around your sushi. And they found when people ate sushi, and the nori especially, that there were bacteria naturally found in this seaweed, that when you ate it, that bacteria released genes that programmed the gut's microbiome, the bacteria in your gut. It programmed your gut bacteria as to which enzymes to release to digest the nori, so it could release the nutrients that the bacteria wanted that were already on the nori, but also benefited your gut microbiome. I mean, wow. So what's the quickest way to kill off bacteria on your fruit and veggies? Eat pesticide-laden food. Put it in a microwave. What is a microwave designed to do? To kill life, to sterilise stuff. So we have Western countries and populations eating shit food that has full of pesticides that we chuck in a microwave oven, and we're wondering why we are sick. We have children that are born through cesarean, and look, that's justified in many cases. My kids were born emergency cesarean because I had undiagnosed preeclampsia. That's another story. So thank God for that. However, it means that their microbiome reflected my skin, not my vaginal flora. That's number one huge risk factor for many childhood illnesses like autism, eczema and asthma. The second thing that a child needs, a baby when they're born, of course, is breast milk. Breast milk containing all the important prebiotics to support that gut's health. Many of our Western children are given infant formula, which is dead. And what do? Is they put it in a polycarbonate plastic bottle full of BPA and put it in a microwave. What hope do our Western children have of actually reducing the risk of asthma and allergies when we know that is the key risk, that their microbiome is critical, and we can kill it off in the first 6 months of life by those three factors alone? That's a problem. What else did we do to increase our children's risk in Western countries for asthma and allergies? We use cleaning products that are absolutely devastating in terms of their health. Why? Because the antibacterials that are used, like bleach and ammonia, many of the chemicals that are used kill bacteria. So we gave this impression in the 60s and 70s through this propaganda in the media that in order to have a healthy home, you need to sterilize it. That's what a healthy home is. And it couldn't be further from the truth. So an interesting study that came out last year with the Amish community, they found they were looking at why do the Amish children have virtually very little risks for asthma and allergies, very little asthma and allergies in their population. So they compared the Amish community, and you're familiar with the Amish, they have no electricity, they don't use chemicals, they don't have cars, they use very traditional farming techniques. They compared them to the Hutterites, who have an identical lifestyle and very similar gene profiles to the Amish. The only difference between the two is the Hutterites have much higher levels of asthma and allergies in their children, and the only difference there is they use conventional farming practices and the use of pesticides. So what they did is they tested their household dust for bacteria. And they found in the Amish household dust that the level of the type of bacteria and the level of bacteria and their byproducts, endotoxins, were 8 times more diverse than the Hutterites. So they started to realise that the more diverse the bacteria is in household dust, the lower the risk for asthma and allergies. How can you reduce that? Well, just spray pesticides. And let's face it, I remember I mentioned in this talk, we have pesticides that are detected in polar bear livers. So they're everywhere. This is why one of the important practices you need to implement is to take your shoes off. Because you don't want to bring all the pesticides, the tons of pesticides that the council spray, near your parks, schools, all around the council to keep nature at bay. You're tracking them in. So when you bring pesticides on your shoes into the household dust, onto the carpet, where is your infant's breathing zone? Right there at the carpet. So you've killed off the natural bacteria in the household dust, which may actually be really important for their gut microbiome. Why? Because the hand-to-mouth ratio is 8 times higher in an infant than it is an adult. They're ingesting 8 times more dust than an adult is. Why? Because they're constantly putting their fingers in their mouth and the breathing zone is right there at the carpet. So the more diverse the bacteria is in the household dust, the lower the risk for asthma and allergies. So you need to take your shoes off, and you need not to bring pesticides in the house. Many times I've gone into people's homes and there's more Mortein cans there than there are in the supermarket, because they've been duped by the propaganda of the TV and advertisement. Best thing we can do for our kids is to turn off the TV and to actually get them to critically think. Because gone are the days, in my days, where we had the Encyclopedia Britannica there, and that was our knowledge base. Now children are inundated with information. How do they deal with that? They have to learn to critically think now. It's very different to when we grew up. So that's very important to get that across, that the bacteria in your household dust may be a very important risk or reduction in risk in relation to their risk for asthma and allergies. So that's something that we look at as building biologists. Where are the chemicals coming from? Keep your shoes outside. I've mentioned already, keep shoes outside, don't bring them in. Very important. Secondly, eat organic food. Probably the best recommendation I give with relation to your diet. I used to train over 2,000 naturopaths in nutrition in their 4th year nutrition at Melbourne College of Natural Medicine years ago and Southern School of Natural Therapies. Best advice I can give you to summarise my 120-hour course is when you eat food, follow the slow principles. Seasonal, local, organic, and whole, still in its natural state. Move away from processed foods, because processed foods do not provide you with the resilience and nutrition you need to detox everything you're exposing to. Very important. Other tips on how to reduce chemical exposure, we're looking at, why are women putting this crap on their body? What do we have in these products? We have preservatives. What's a preservative? It's an antibacterial. So by putting these chemicals in our bodies, we're putting antibacterials on. And what are we doing to Staphylococcus, epidermidis? What are we doing to Micrococcus and Pseudomonas? We're killing it off. And yet we've found in this study that it's actually useful to detox chemicals before they get in the systemic circulation.
So what about things like coconut oil?
Coconut oil is not good for skin at all. The only reason I use coconut oil, and certainly not ingestion, is to get my eyeliner and mascara off. Excellent, because it dissolves. But coconut should not be put on your skin. It's very fatty, doesn't allow it to breathe. Instead, you want something that naturally reflects the skin oil, like jojoba, macadamia nut oil, camellia nut oil, sweet almond oil. Excellent. But coconut is actually not a good one on your skin. But to get rid of, as to dissolve eyeliner and mascara, fantastic on a cotton tip, awesome. Yep. And I described this in my book, Healthy Home, Healthy Family, in detail. Yep. So personal care products, I really want, I think it's interesting that women are encouraged to wear makeup and to wear personal care products as this anti-aging, you attract a partner, perfume. Most men hate perfume. Why are women being conned to do this when it is robbing them of their breasts and their fertility? Many of these chemicals, which I showed in my first paper, which was titled Environmental Chemical Assessment and Clinical Practice, Unveiling the Elephant in the Room. I love elephants, because there's elephants in every or one of our homes, as I've indicated. Indicates that many of the chemicals in women's products are hormone disrupting chemicals, and they can have devastating impacts. If you wear body butters that get rid of stretch marks and you expose your body to that because you put it on your skin, now in the blood and goes straight into the placenta where it affects an unborn child who's going through critical windows of development. Those hormone disruptors may not affect you because you're not going through puberty and through huge growth spurts, but it certainly could be affecting the fetus. And we've had decades of research on this. The father of BPA, Frederick von Saal, was talking about this in the 60s with all these rodent studies. And he showed that the impact of xenoestrogens, synthetic estrogens in our phthalates, in our perfumes, in our pesticides, many of the pesticides are hormone disruptors, is that that can have devastating impacts on the rodents' fertility. And in fact, if you expose estrogen to a male pup in the rat when it's pregnant, it becomes aggressive and is more likely to kill its own child when it becomes an adult. Estrogens aren't this fuzzy hormone, oh, everything's fine. No, estrogen in males makes them aggressive. So this is interesting in terms of the whole autism thing as well, that that autism is 4 times higher in males and females, and what have we launched is high levels of xenoestrogens, synthetic estrogens, into everyday products. Pesticides, phthalates, plastics, preservatives, many of them, the 4 Ps I refer to them as. That's why we need to stop perfume unless it's an essential oil based. We need to reduce our pesticide load. We certainly don't want to be spraying our homes with pesticides. I remember when I first got together with my husband, we started living together, I didn't know he had a Mortein can, and he was chasing one fly with an entire can of Mortein. And I said, sweetheart, I love you, but if you continue that, we're divorcing. I don't do pesticides. Like, we're the pest here. They have been here, we've built a house there, we're the pests, we're on their territory here. So if you're going to deal with pest management, there's 3 very simple rules. don't give them shelter, don't give them moisture, and don't give them food. It means you have to clean up after yourself after you've put the dishes away, because any food is going to be the smell to attract the pests. Like Integrated Pest Management 101, very simple. We don't need chemicals. So, you know, my kids, when they do watch TV and they see, you know, the pesticide sprays on the wall spraying every X amount of, God knows how many minutes, it's a disaster, because those pesticides are strongly correlated with autism and learning disorders and Parkinson's. It's not a coincidence that the highest levels of Parkinson's medication are happening in farming communities. You know, they did an interesting study in Australia 2 years ago, and they were looking at where is the Parkinson's drugs being given, and where they're being given is high levels in northwest Victoria. And in a farming community, the farmers have, many of them have high levels of Parkinson's in other occupations. My father has Parkinson's. He was a garden sprinkler installer, and he was exposed to high levels of the organochlorine pesticides and organophosphates. It's not a coincidence. Interesting in rodent studies that rodents that have induced Parkinson's can be completely cured by getting a healthy rodent's poo and shoving it up the other backside. Why? Because the bacteria in your gut program whether you are sick or not well. So the first thing you need to do with any chronic illness or to prevent chronic illness is to look at your gut. Don't have chlorinated water, rule number 1. Rule number 2, pesticides. No pesticide sprays in the house. Get integrated pest management, and I go into detail on that in my book, Healthy Home, Healthy Family. Don't put shit on your body or your face loaded with preservatives. That's not a good idea. Yep. Think about the chemicals you're bringing into the home. That if they're not safe enough to eat, if they're not food grade, then you don't have them in the house. So go back. Don't start questioning everything, because as I discuss in my first book, the way chemicals are assessed is completely inadequate. We look at one chemical on a group of rats, give enough till 50% die, and then we establish what we call the lethal dose 50, and then we get rid of the rats that survive that, so we don't know the long-term consequences. Instead, the most effective way to know how bad the environment has become and its impact on human health is to wait till the disease occurs in the human populations, until we get the breast cancer clusters, until we get the Parkinson's clusters, until we get the cancers, and then we go, let's look back and see what caused that. That's the reality of how we determine illnesses in human population. And you know what? That's not right, because our way that we assess chemicals is completely ineffective. Things are changing, and thanks to genome-wide studies, etc., we're getting a much better idea who's susceptible, and we're getting better techniques to be able to determine and map this person with these genes, how they detox with this microbiome, and these exposures come together and go, okay, this is your risk then for these types of illnesses. That's coming. We refer to that as personalised medicine. And fortunately it is coming, but it's going to take another generation of clinicians to even understand how to implement all of that. Mould. Mould is a big part of the work we do as building biologists. I would argue mould is actually one of the major causes of chemical sensitivity. It's not in the literature. Based on my experience looking at the biochemical pathways and dealing with patients with mould sensitivities, many of them develop what we refer to as chronic fatigue syndrome, which is a misdiagnosis. Chronic fatigue syndrome is a syndrome you get when no one knows what the hell's going on. That is not the right diagnosis. What we do know is that there's a whole lot of inflammation in these patients, and we need to know what's triggered that inflammation. Mould, what happens? 1 in 4 people in the population can't deal or develop antibodies to mould. So what happens in these patients is every time they walk into a water damaged environment, the immune system has Alzheimer's, and it goes, oh, I don't remember these antigens, bacteria, gram-negative bacteria, and mould, fungal, particulate, hyphae, endotoxins, mycotoxins, which are unique in a water damaged environment. You walk into your home, you've been living there 20 years, your immune system, if you're 1 in 4 of these populations that can't create antibodies to mould, walks in and goes, I don't remember this. So let's set up the first level of response, the immune response, which is inflammation. I want you to imagine you're playing basketball. I played basketball last night. I didn't roll my ankle, but pretend I did. I rolled my ankle. What's going to happen? What symptoms am I going to get?
Redness, swelling, heat.
Pain. Excellent. The 4 R's. So redness, swelling, heat and pain. That's what's going to happen. Your body's going to say, don't move it, because it's going to heal it. That's what it wants to do. Now imagine that in the brain. Now you get a good insight as to what patients with chronic fatigue or chronic inflammatory response have. The inflammation is in their system, in their neurological central nervous system. So it sets up this inflammation because the immune system doesn't recognise, can't create the antibodies. So the second part of the innate immune response is to tell the acquired immune response to create the soldiers or proteins or immunoglobulins to say, next time you walk into your home, I recognise you, I encapsulate you, I deal with you, and I get you out through the bile. That doesn't happen. So every time they walk in, it sets up inflammation, and it doesn't go to the second part. What does that mean? That inflammation knocks out key neuropeptides, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. It's not a coincidence that that neurotransmitter in the hypothalamus is called vasoactive intestinal polypeptide, because what it does is it affects the gut permeability. So over time, the inflammation, by affecting these neuropeptides, causes the gut to become more permeable. And what happens to these patients? This is how the symptoms begin. A headache, mild headaches that persist, keep coming back. Fatigue, for no apparent reason. Eventually, they don't sleep very well. They have to sleep during the day. The whole circadian rhythm is stuffed. They actually can't sleep at night very well because melanocyte-stimulating hormone, which is very much interrelated with melatonin, is no longer functioning very well and has been suppressed. So now you don't sleep well, now your circadian rhythm's stuffed, now your reproduction fertility is affected. The reason why puberty starts is because melatonin drops. That's the reason why puberty starts. And what have we done to suppress melatonin? We introduce electromagnetic fields in cell phones right next to our head. That's dumb. I love my cell phone, but I would never put it near my head because the physics of radiation is clear. As you double the distance away from that antenna in there, you reduce it by 95%. So don't put your phone near your head, because what you're going to do is increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. So if you are in a mouldy home, it's going to go straight, it's got a free invitation to the central nervous system. That's a problem, because now we have synergistic effects, EMFs, chemicals and mould. So going back to mould, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, vasoactive intestinal polypeptide are knocked out. So now your gut becomes permeable. Now you develop intolerance to food. That's interesting because you weren't born with celiac disease, but now you can't tolerate gluten. And what does a naturopath do? They take you off gluten. Not a good idea, because that didn't cause the problem. It was the inflammation in the brain that causes the gut to become permeable. So this is the problem. Clinicians and naturopaths, of course I'm a naturopath, I love my naturopaths, they're there because they want to help the community, but they're not being trained enough as to what's really going on. And as long as that patient is in a water-damaged environment, they will never get better. It's not viable unless they remediate it effectively, if that's possible, or they move out. So that inflammation is now making them get food sensitivities, and that's a new thought. No one's actually talked about that in the scientific literature, but without fail, all of my patients, this is the progression of their illnesses. The headaches, the fatigue, then the sleep problems, then digestive problems, and I can't tolerate these foods, and then of course fibromyalgia and muscular aches and pains. So why does that happen? Because the inflammation in the capillaries stops the circulation, builds up lactic acid. Now it can't move, so now you've got pain moving in different parts of the body. And it's not diagnosable, like doesn't make sense. The big problem with mould is two. When it shuts down melanocyte-stimulating hormone, that is the key neurotransmitter to control infections in the body. So now you have infections in the upper respiratory passages, where you refer to these as multiple antibiotic resistance, coagulase negative staph infections that are persistent, and there are only very few antibiotics that will address that. And we now have huge amounts of yeast in your gut, and the naturopaths will correctly say you have candida overgrowth. Yeah, you do, but what they don't don't understand or learn is that it was due because you're living in a mouldy environment that knocked out a key neurotransmitter that now you can't control infections in your body. And one of the most key useful biomarkers for this is the organic acids tests, which are available to naturopaths, but they don't understand how to read the tests that show that the yeast metabolites are actually causing all these other symptoms. So the symptoms of mould is because of infection, bacterial and yeast infections in your body. That results in inflammation, chronic inflammation that are utilising all your antioxidants. So now you can't eat enough good food to even be able to deal, because the amount of free radicals you're creating in inflammation, your antioxidant systems can't keep up. So now you get sick, and now you accelerate your ageing, and of course your illnesses just escalate. All ageing all chronic illness is escalated ageing. Huge amounts of free radicals, huge amounts of inflammation. And in the first chapter of my book, I look at this. Aging and chronic illness is oxidative stress at a cellular level, inflammation at a systemic level. That's what it is. So clinicians need to be trained to get rid of their boxes, I think, and they need to start going, where on the inflammatory scale is this patient? What's causing that inflammation, and how can we address that and get them so that the hormesis effect kicks in, that the level of inflammation they're creating is equal to the level of the antioxidant defense mechanism, and then you slow aging and you stop these illnesses. But we don't train practitioners to do this, unfortunately, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So does that give you a good explanation as to how chronic are these, especially in a water damaged environment? It's not just mould. In fact, mould isn't the issue in a water damaged environment. It's a chemical stew of biological agents that as soon as you have water sitting on a surface for more than 48 hours, the bacteria and the mould fungi start producing chemicals to try and kill each other off, to take over the site. Because fungi are nature's greatest decomposers. They're meant to be there. They're not the enemy. The enemy is moisture and dampness. And in the scientific literature, I'm doing a systematic review on that at the moment, shows that dampness, which is seen as visible mould and or odour and or history of water damage, is sufficient to cause asthma and allergies. That's a given. I would argue most of our asthma and allergies in Australia are probably due to a water damaged environment. And yet we see organisations like the Asthma Foundation doing a hell of a lot of research to treat symptoms when we should be getting to the cause of the problem. Who cares what acupuncture points to treat asthma if they continue to live in a water damaged environment? And we know it triggers these symptoms. Asthma and allergies are the first thing. So this is why, as a naturopath acupuncturist, how can I possibly treat patients? I have to be honest, I'm treating symptoms. I'm not a holistic practitioner. I was never trained that way, even though I was told I was. We need to get to the cause of the patient's problems. Asthma and allergies are mainly due to water damaged environments, as far as I'm concerned, and a lot of the literature is indicating that. Chronic fatigue syndrome and illnesses, chemicals. The second thing, apart from affecting and causing infection throughout your body, the second reason why water damaged building is a problem is because once you have these yeast metabolites in your bowel, it produces a huge amounts of byproducts and metabolites. These metabolites use key liver detoxification pathways that block phase 2 sulfation and glucuronidation. Now what does that mean? That's really significant, and why it's significant is because when you have all of these infections in your body going on and it blocks the liver detoxification pathway, what that is actually doing is preventing neurotransmitters like dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, serotonin and melatonin from being detoxed. So one of the last symptoms that develop in these patients is mental illness, which is not mental illness, it's a detoxification issue, where you actually think you're going mad. You have brain fog. You're reading a sentence, you have to read the page a million times and you still don't get what's on the page. Where you become dyslexic, where you're reading it and going, I don't know what that word is. In the middle of the sentence you're going, you know that thing there that's on the floor? Oh, that's why it's a chair. The word's not coming out. We call it anomia, missing words mid-sentence. Classic for patients with these chronic inflammatory responses. Brain brain fog. The brain fog is not, and of course they develop anxiety and depression, but it is not a true mental illness, and I think psychologists have a lot to answer for, and they need to learn what is actually going on that's leading to many of these mental illnesses that are not mental illnesses. They are detoxification problems. Once you get them out of the water damaged environment, you then need to see a great clinician to be able to provide binders to get rid of their biotoxins, because what happens in many of these patients, 1 in 4, is that when they're out of that environment they improve a lot, but they're not always entirely better because they have to reduce their chemical load. Their threshold is reached. They have to not only get out of that water damaged environment, they have to get rid of the chemicals in their life, pesticides, phthalates, plastics, because the detoxification of these chemicals is completely compromised. Mould is a detoxification issue. So you have to get rid of the traffic jam right there in phase 2. And once you do that, suddenly melatonin, serotonin, and your catecholamines can get through the pathway, and mentally you think, oh my God, I've got my body back. So this is why there is hope. We are starting to get a much better idea why many of these people have chronic inflammatory illnesses that aren't chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalitis. They're strongly correlated with water damaged environments and or high levels of chemical exposure and or low levels to chronic chemical exposures for that genotype. Remember, there's a 10-fold difference between how you and I could actually detox chemicals. One man's meat is another man's poison. There's the canaries in the mind, and I would argue in my paper that in fact the best biomarker we have as a society are the canaries in the environment. You guys. You are so important to us because you are warning us that there's a problem, Houston, and we need to address that. And your system and your body's uniquely identified that. And in the past, in the tribes, you were the one who, during the dinosaur time, went up to the dinosaur meat, smelt it, and went, guys, you can't touch that, that's off. I would have eaten it and died, but you would have saved the tribe. Because one of the key things you have is your ability to smell. You can smell damp from a mile away. You're sensitive to chemicals because your body is saying, don't go near there. And one of the most interesting things I found with my research that was published in May this year, identifying, and interviewing the 17 top environmental doctors, was the fact that in terms of these canaries, I've just lost my thought. The canaries, what were they going to say about that? Smells. Yeah. He said that of treating patients with chronic fatigue syndrome for 35 years, he said to me, Nicole, how many of these patients do you think develop cancer? Because that's all he does, 35 years of treating patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. He said I had 4 patients with chronic fatigue syndrome who developed cancer. He said, why do you think they don't get cancer? I said, I'm not sure. He said, because they know, their body's telling them, don't stay around the perfume department of David Jones.
Oh, that is just shocking.
Don't go near people with pesticides. Their bodies are telling them that's a problem.
Coals either.
Yeah. Interesting thing is that those of us who aren't the canaries, we work in Parks Victoria and other things, and we use the glyphosate, and we don't have problems, but we die of heart disease or cancer. Choose, pick your choice, cardiovascular disease or cancer. Very interesting. We need to listen to you guys because you are warning society there's a freaking problem here and we need to address it. So why is mould escalated? 3 decades ago, several factors happened that resulted in the perfect storm. The first of those was the replacement of metal pipes with flexible braided water hoses. Flexible braided water hoses, those pipes under your sink that can flex. Fabulous because they reduce the plumber's time to install them, so they're cheap. Unfortunately, a lot of them coming from parts around the world where they're very poor quality. They're only designed to last 7 years. If you have any cleaning products like bleach or ammonia in the cupboard where the hoses are, you'll accelerate corrosion of that flexible steel and increase your risk of a water event. Last year, insurance companies spent $320 million in insurance claims because of the bursting and splitting of flexible braided water hoses. So every time you get a plumber come in, you need to check that that hose, if it's more than 7 years old, replace it. It's worth replacing it because it is the #1 cause of water events in Australia.
The other thing I've noticed, I've done quite a few property things over the years also, is that they leak. You move into a new property. I've moved into a new property away from my mould. The laundry, there's a leak under there from where it's connected. The kitchen leak under there.
And that's the thing, yeah.
And I said, go around and just tighten everything, please.
Yes, and that's the thing, they don't realise, especially for do-it-yourself person does the plumbing, when you put the connections in, tighten the first one and the second, whenever you put the second one in, the first one becomes loose. And there was an actually advisory panel of expert plumbers talking about this issue this year, about what happens when they don't connect it appropriately. The other thing that's happened is waterproof membranes. 25 years ago, 2 to 3 decades, we went from sheet-based waterproof membranes to liquid coating membranes. You know the liquid stuff they coat in when you're doing a bathroom reno and they paint the liquid-based membrane? That's not good because it's only designed to last 7 years. Now can you imagine having to do a bathroom reno every 7 years? In fact, if you use conventional cleaning products on your tiles, or if you use essential oils, this whole thing of essential oils using cleaning products is ridiculous, because I love my essential oils, I use them as my perfume, I use them as vaporizers, but I would never use essential oils to clean. Why? Because they're solvents. If you use essential oils on your bathroom tiles, it gets through the ground. Guess what it's going to do? It's going to dissolve your waterproof membrane and affect the elongation of your membrane. That's something most people don't know. So they've got all this ridiculous thing on essential oils. Not good. We'll ask questions at the end. So waterproof membranes are an issue. The second thing is the Australian Standards 3740 doesn't tell the waterproofers which one to pick, which waterproof membrane, and how to install it. It is such a problem that a waterproof advisory committee was set up in May this year through the Master Builders because it's a crisis. We now have 85% of all new apartments built since 2003, 83% with significant building defects, mainly due to water ingress issues in Sydney, from that study, University of New South Wales. Nearly, I think it was 83% of apartments. We have new apartments coming up within 2 to 5 years have water-based issues because the waterproof membranes were not installed properly, but the builder can't be sued because they're complying with the Australian standard and they're complying with the building code. But the building code and Australian standards are completely inadequate. What have we done in the last 2 decades is we've introduced thermal performance requirements that all new homes have to have a 6-star energy rating. Well, that's dumb. Why? Because we use impermeable wall wraps. So now with double insulated glass, steel frame, metal roof, the house cannot allow water vapour to move through the skin. And it didn't take into consideration you breathe water vapour. Every person in that apartment or house will emit about 10 litres of water vapour into the air every day. And the new thermal efficiency performance forgot to think about that this water vapour created from bathing, breathing, cooking and washing needs to go somewhere. That's why I'll live in an old home that's drafty, that allows this water vapour to move. So it's really important with our new builds, and this is where building biologists like us can help you, is how to build a healthy home. Because if you build according to this 6-star energy rating, which you still can, but you would never ever use impermeable wall wraps. Because once that moisture hits that wrap and it hits the dew point, it condenses, and now we have a hidden mould problem. So waterproof membranes, thermal performance efficiency, bushfire zone, Australian standard, introduced because of the bushfire issue as a result of Black Saturday. Now does not require roof ventilation. Well, that's a problem, because if you've got a new house that has no roof ventilation and you're pumping all of your exhaust air from your shower into the roof, hits dew point, condenses, that's dumb. This is the perfect storm. So mould-related illnesses and fatiguing syndrome, I have no doubt it is escalating. It is going to increase. Chemical sensitivity is going to increase because mould is a chemical sensitivity. So what have we done? We've introduced chemicals into all of our bodies, and they're increasing with each generation. We've created homes that are sick. This is why I created the course, the Advanced Diploma of Building Biology. It's a 2-year full-time course, 4 years part-time. the only government accredited mould testing course in Australia, to look at our homes are contributing to most illnesses that we see every day in clinical practice. We need to train clinicians. I spend a lot of my time educating the doctors in medical conferences, and they're listening. A lot of the integrative doctors are listening. It's good to see. But we need to do so much more. We need to get into the undergraduate courses, and we need to train them how to take an environmental exposure history. Instead of focusing on treating symptoms, we need to focus on getting to the cause of the patient's problem. Electromagnetic fields, I haven't touched on. We spend 250 hours on electromagnetic fields in the building biology course. Big. The EMFs found in the built environment are AC magnetic fields created from current. So your appliances like your fridges, your ovens, your meter panel, smart meters, inverters from solar panels are going to create high magnetic fields, and they won't be a problem providing you're not spending time near them is important. So you would never put an inverter, meter panel, fridge near the bed head, near the parts of the house where you spend time. The AC magnetic fields and the radio frequencies used in wireless technology were classified by the International Agency for Research on Council as possibly carcinogenic to humans, Group 2B. 2002, that was classified for magnetic fields. 31st of May 2011, the World Health Organization said your mobile phones and all your wireless devices are probably carcinogenic, which should have implemented the precautionary principle, which is never put it near your head. Use the physics of radiation. Keep it away from your body. Many of the clients, a percentage of patients I saw with chronic fatigue started with a high electromagnetic field exposure, not chemicals or mould. But once you're sensitive to EMFs, you're sensitive to chemicals and mould. Once you're sensitive to chemicals, you're sensitive to mould and EMFs. You cannot separate them. You have to look at all of them, which is why I discuss this at length in my book, Healthy Home, Healthy Family. Because once you're sensitive to one, it causes this inflammation. And it's the inflammation and the triggers of inflammation that you have to deal with at once, not just one of them. Chemicals, that's why a lot of people would reduce the chemicals, they're still unwell, because they didn't realise that the mould creates huge amounts of metabolites and chemicals that detox your detoxification problems. So electromagnetic fields, you don't want to be sleeping near them, that's for sure. You want to make sure your bed, which is the most important room of your entire house because you spend 22 years of your life in your bed. You want to make sure that mattress is healthy, not loaded with dust mite or sweat or chemotherapeutic drugs because your partner went through cancer. The high levels of toxicity, that's a big environmental exposure history. If you've got a patient who had that mattress exposed to chemotherapeutic drugs, that is so toxic that we can't even touch it with our bare hands according to mould remediation, because it'll be loaded with these drugs. Where do you get rid of it? Through your sweat. If they are on marijuana, if any prescriptive drugs, and certainly some types of recreational drugs, they sweat. That's where we get rid of a lot of a sweat at night time. So knowing who you're sleeping with and what they've been on is important to determine what the toxic load is in that mattress. That's important from my perspective. No one looks at that in terms of toxicology. That's a big one. You know, I've had kids with asthma and allergies who got their mattress from their grandparents where it was in their garage for 2 decades, loaded with mould, and the kids sleeping on it, and they're averaging 8 to 9 courses of antibiotics every year. Not one doctor or naturopath bothered to ask about the mattress. That's a problem. We need to completely rechange how we diagnose illnesses. We need to move away from symptom approach, and we need to get to the cause of the patient's illnesses. We need to ask enough questions to identify what's causing it, because there's always a reason why you are sick. Yep. And you think you're going mad? You are, because your detoxification process is completely clogged. And when you address the detoxification, you're going to get your life back, hopefully. Now, if it persists for long term, then there'll be long-term damage from that. So the sooner we can train practitioners to identify this, the sooner we'll have a better, healthier society. But because there's systemic issues across multiple industries, from building and construction to mould remediation and restoration, it's a dog's breakfast out there, to testing, no regulation, clinicians, naturopaths and doctors, almost every industry is involved. And unfortunately, it's going to take a mass movement and a citizen science project to improve it. So I'm hoping, the interesting thing being at RMIT doing PhDs, I can't get funding, because who wants to fund someone who's going to get to the cause of illnesses? Whereas, good pat on the back for, wow. I sit through all these milestone reviews, and the people who get the pat on the back are the ones who prove that drug is good on that PAP receptor in the liver for that drug, for that illness. Who gives a shit? There's a place for drugs, I get it. There's a place for supplements and herbs, definitely. Nutrition is important to gain resilience, but if we don't ask enough questions to get to the cause of the illness, we will never practice holistic medicine. And that's the thing that frustrated me, spending 8 years at university, $60,000 in a double degree, when I didn't actually have the knowledge or the skills to help these patients. So it's taken me 20 years working in this industry, setting up the building biology industry from scratch, and finally I see my tribe getting out there. Most of our work is coming from integrative doctors, which is fantastic to work with them. They've got very tricky patients like you guys, and we're going into the house and going, this is how many elephants are in that patient's house, and this is what we need to do to reduce it. Most of the time we just educate the patient, which is ironic because the word docere means teacher, and we provide that patient with the ability to make an informed choice. Most people and the sheep out there don't understand they will never be able to make an informed choice because they don't understand that how chemicals are regulated, how electromagnetic fields are regulated is not to actually support public health. It's to support manufacturing and to create dividends for shareholders, unfortunately. But it doesn't have to be like this. It could be so much better. And this is why we need to start the revolution. So my husband and I sold our house and we invested the entire amount for a manufacturing facility to create personal care products and cleaning products for people with sensitivities, and products that my kids, I would be happy enough for my children to use, and cleaning products to clean the house. It's called the Abode cleaning product range. It's available in health food stores across Australia. And if you are sensitive or have fatiguing illnesses, use the Zero range, which means it's no essential oils in there. It's fragrance free. That's the best one to use. We're about to launch our personal care products, and it's not skin products and moisturisers because I don't use it on my body. So how can I promote a product that I wouldn't want to put it on my body? And basically, it's soaps, body soaps, hand washes, and shampoos and conditioners, developed from the ground up for people with sensitivities. The Environmental Working Group, all of our products comply with the Environmental Working Group, which is one of the first companies in the world to do that, because there's so much data about which ingredients cause which illnesses. And I think what really annoyed me, because I have children with eczema, I have my husband who has severe hay fever and eczema, that we wanted something that worked, but also that wasn't going to affect them and contribute to their health problems. So for more information about the work that I do, the third edition of the book, Healthy Home, Healthy Family, came out in January this year. It's got checklists on how to assess your home. So you mentioned before, well, if I move out of my mouldy environment, what do I do? Well, there's some really good questions. Great. A lot of information there. In terms of how to deal with contents, that's in there as well, in terms of mould-related issues. How to reduce your exposure to chemicals, electromagnetic fields, and the latest evidence as to why we need to act is in there. It's available online. I have some copies here for sale if you're interested. Thank you so much.